Hey everybody, Rich from Sticky's RC, and today I'm bringing you a video about the Radiolink RC6GS 6-channel transmitter. This is the V2 version. I'm going to be going step by step, item by item through the menu of this controller and showing you and trying to explain what all of the different things are, what all of the different programming functions are, and what is going to basically happen when you change the different things in the menu. There are a couple of things that I don't go into. The big one is mixing. I don't do a lot of mixing in my controllers, so I'm not really all that great about it. And what I suggest is, if you do need to use the mixing for this controller, go to Radiolink's website, check out the manual that they have online for this controller, and they have a very in-depth explanation and step-by-step process for going through and programming the mixing for this controller. So with that being said, this is a pretty lengthy video, so I suggest you go grab your controller, grab a drink, sit back, and check out the programming and tuning of this pretty awesome little radio. So the first thing I'm going to go through with this radio is just what all of the buttons and dials and everything do on this controller. So we'll start with the obvious ones: the steering wheel, the throttle, the antenna, the power switch, and also the little door that opens up so that you can plug a USB cable in to do software updates, which Radiolink does do on occasion for their models. The next switches we'll take a look at are the trim switches. So here you have your steering trim, your throttle trim, and the trim for the third channel. There is also another trim button for the third channel, which is this dial over here. Next, you're going to have two buttons that are sort of hidden here. This will operate the fourth channel and is basically an on-off switch for your fourth channel. And it also toggles itself to always being in one position. So it is a one or the other position switch. So let's say you have something that you want to turn on and off in your car and you have a switch for. You can press this button and turn it on, release the button, turn it off. The other items here you see are two toggle switches. Now this is the fifth channel and this is the sixth channel. And these are three position switches, which are end, center, and end. So if you have, for instance, a Capra that has a rear steering function where you have a left, a middle, and a right function, you can set this remote to power that on either the fifth or the sixth channel. Lastly, there is this button here on the controller which does light up, and this is actually a programmable switch. So you can program this switch to operate under any of the different channels. Those are the basics. That is the button layout and everything for the remote. There's a couple other things that you'll see here. For instance, this hole in the top, this is actually a mount that you can get a bracket to put in there for an FPV so that you can have your phone sitting up on your remote. There's also another connector point over here for an FPV, so you can have that mounted onto the side if you like. And we're going to start looking through the menu, the options, and the features of this controller. I'm also going to be going in depth and explaining how some of the adjustments and what the adjustments in each feature of the controller does and how it works and how it will apply to your car. So let's get started. The first thing you do in order to access the features menu of this radio is you press the two outer buttons. That would be the exit and enter buttons, and that will take you into the menu mode. Then the two inner buttons, the plus and the minus, will scroll up and down through the menu. You'll notice that there is a tone that happens each time you go through each different item. Some of the items in the menu are a little more self-explanatory. For instance, language. You can choose which language you would like to use, English or Chinese. Those are the only two options that are available. The next is the model portion of the menu, and this will simply allow you to choose one of 10 different model settings that you have in the radio, meaning that you can have 10 different receivers set up in 10 different cars, and when you individually program each model into your controller's settings, those settings will stay within that model. So for instance, if you want to use this car with a basher where you're going to use the gyro and the telemetry and the ABS, you can have it set up in one model. In the other hand, if you're also going to be using this for a crawler, you may not need the gyro or the ABS set up, so you can turn those functions off in a different model. All you have to remember is just which model number you have it saved under. The next is the endpoint adjustments. Now this is something that's very, very important, especially when it comes to steering. You want to set up the endpoints so that your steering servo is going to the maximum that it can, but it's not being bound by taking your steering too far. Now if your steering has a lock to lock position, you don't want the servo to be pushing the steering and the tires and everything against that locked position. You're going to burn up your servo. This is something that's happened quite a few times. I'm sure everybody has experienced it. Okay, so next up on the menu, we have the steering exponential. That is option number 4. And what this is right now, I haven't set this up, but this is a curve for your steering. So when you're turning the wheel, right now it is linear, so essentially as fast as I turn the wheel is as fast as the servo is turning left and right. But you can adjust this curve so that, for instance, when you first turn the wheel, the servo turns faster, or maybe the servo turns slower. Maybe you have a tendency to jerk your controller and you don't want the servo to turn that quickly. You can adjust this curve by pressing on the, there you go, press on the enter button, and then as you will see, the curve begins to change. Number 5 on the list now is the steering speed. This is a very cool function, and that is that you can adjust up or down the speed of which your servo moves, and you can also adjust the speed up or down to how quickly your servo returns back to its 0 point. So if you wanted to return back, say, as quickly as the wheel does, you can increase that return speed. If you want the wheels to turn slower, you can turn that down on the turn speed. This is a pretty handy function if you have a car generally that goes very, very fast and has a tendency to maybe roll over. If you turn the steering wheel too quickly, you can actually adjust it in the controller to slow down the steering to help you, if you have a tendency to jerk that wheel like I do, to slow that servo down so that it can't get to that end point as quickly as it does, and slows down the steering so that your car won't traction roll over on you all the time. Throttle exponential. For the throttle exponential, there are 4 different options of how you can adjust the curve for the exponential. Typically, I use the forward EXP mode. I will turn this option to on, and then as you can see, you can adjust the curve. Now, as you can see, my curve starts out very, very flat and then ramps up to a more linear carrying on of the throttle application. So what that means is, in the beginning throw of the throttle trigger, say the first 3/8 to half of the throttle throw, there's only very, very little throttle application that's going to the car. So that allows me, especially when crawling, to control that very, very low speed, crawling speed that I need with a much wider range on the trigger. Now this means that I don't have to be super precise with my finger in order to keep low speed applications happening precisely. But when I start to get past halfway point on the throttle throw, then I start to apply a more linear curve going up, applying the throttle. So the next option on our menu is the throttle speed. Now, something that happens when you adjust the throttle exponential affects the throttle speed. And that's primarily because I'm now programming my throttle through the throttle exponential, and now I'm not allowed to change the actual speed of the servo because that is now being controlled by my throttle exponential. But essentially, the throttle speed works the same as the steering speed. If you want to adjust how quickly the throttle ramps up and returns back to zero, you would do that here. This is probably something that more applies to, say, a nitro car, where the throttle up and throttle return and braking is a little bit more critical to keeping the motor running smoothly. Next up in our menu functions is the ABS. And yes, ABS is exactly what you think it is. It's the same as the ABS that's in your normal one-to-one car. And that is a automated braking system, which is when you apply the brakes heavily, it pumps the brakes to keep you from locking up the tires. Whereas in the RC world and in this controller, it's more working along the lines of not really a backup system, but really a system to assist the car's braking system, because typically you would be braking by just pressing forward on the trigger and applying the brakes. However, with the ABS system set up and turned on, with the car that it works on, you could essentially have an ABS braking system in your car. Now, going into how an ABS system assists a car's handling is a whole different subject, and I suggest going in and reading about how ABS assists, say, a four-wheel drive car, or a drifter car, or something to that effect, and learning about that in its entirety in depth, because it is a very in-depth discussion. But for here, I'm really just giving you the basics of how the ABS on this system works. So the first is the mode, which turns the ABS on and off. So the next item is the ABP, and this is set at, by the factory, set at 50. Now what that means is when you're releasing the trigger from the braking position back to the normal position, while the ABS is working, it will actually only return it back to 50% of zero, so thusly still applying the brakes halfway. Next function is the delay. Now the delay is when the braking function happens to when the ABS starts to apply. The next option is the cycle, and that is the number of pulses that are applied to the brakes when you first initially apply the brake pressure and the ABS kicks in. Next is the TGP. Now this is actually when the ABS begins to work at the position of the throttle trigger itself. From the factory, it comes set at 30. So that means at 30% of you applying the brakes is when the ABS function will start to work. The next item in the menu is the duty cycles. Now this is the actual duration of the pulses applying the brakes on and off in the ABS function. The number of cycles that applied is set here with the number 5. The pace at which those cycles happen is set here at duty. I said duty. The next function in the ABS is the steering mixer. Now, this comes from the factory as turned off. What can happen is you can have the ABS automatically apply when you get to a certain point on the steering or a certain throw of the steering wheel itself. This is something that I've never really tried to use myself because I don't do a lot of drifting and bashing per se, but to me this seems like something that would be would require a lot of trial and error in order to get this to work out exactly perfect. So next up on the menu is the ninth item, which is the acceleration. And this is essentially the acceleration of the forward and the brake in your throttle, servo, or electronic speed control. So this will adjust your speed of the throttle up or down, and also adjust the speed of the braking up or down. This is also something that happens in the exponential as well, so this is not typically something that I ever deal with. Alright, number 10 on the menu is the idle up. Now what this function I generally take it as is this is more for the nitro guys, and that is, let's say you need to have the throttle kicked up a little bit when you're turning the engine on in your nitro car. And instead of holding your controller and holding the throttle partially open, you can actually set this to have the idle turn up when you're starting the car, and that gives it that extra throttle it needs in order to get the engine started and get it warmed up. Next item up is number 11 on the menu, and that is the sub trim. Now this enables you to sub trim all 6 of the channels on the radio, the steering, the throttle, channel 3 through channel 6. And what this typically is let's say you have your steering trim here set all the way to one direction, and the steering on your car is still a bit off to one side. You can actually go into the steering sub trim and trim that back to 0, and maybe even a little bit beyond, so that you can go back and reset the quick trim setting a little bit farther, so that you still have a little bit of adjustment. And you can actually go into your steering sub trim and trim that back to a 0 position, and then forget about it, because your normal steering trim will be still set at 0, so that you can make those fine adjustments as you're driving. Same goes with the throttle, the channel 3, channel 4, channel 5, channel 6. No matter what you have, you can come into the sub trim and make minor little adjustments. Let's say you have channel 5 set up for your dig, and the dig servo is pushing a little bit too hard. You can come in here to the sub trim on your number 5 and trim that back a little bit to bring that servo arm in, so maybe it doesn't burn up that dig servo. Okay, number 12 on the menu is the reverse. This one is very, very simple. It is exactly what it says it is, and that is it will reverse any of the 6 channels. I know, me personally, every time I solder a motor to an ESC and the first time I hit the throttle, it's always going in reverse. So the good thing is you can come in here and flip that throttle back around, and bing bing, you got your forward, you got your reverse. Alright, so next up, lucky number 13 on the menu is the dual rate. What that simply does is that allows you to increase or decrease the overall throw of your steering and throttle. So if you feel like your steering isn't going completely lock to lock, you can increase that right here in the dual rate, similar with your throttle. This to me would again be something more along the lines for your nitro guys, where you actually have a servo that's controlling the throttle of the car, and you're not getting full throttle, or maybe not getting full brake. You can go in here, adjust that dual rate, get everything working right. Next up on our menu is item number 14, and this is basically the brake rate adjustment. I typically never mess with this function on any radio because I'm not really quite sure what exactly it does. But essentially what I think it does is it applies the brakes stronger or weaker when you are hitting the brakes. The next 2 channels are mixing channels. Now, I'm not going to go heavily into mixing and setting up mixes and whatnot into controllers, because that is a video in and of itself. Next up, we're on to number 17, and that is the auxiliary channel programming. So essentially what you have here is your channel 3, channel 4, channel 5, and channel 6 programming. So that means that you can program any of these 4 different channels, 3 through 6, to any of the number of different switches that you have on the controller, depending on which channel you need to be able to access the quickest. As I was saying before, this VR button is an on-off. So essentially you press it to turn something on, release it, turn something off. This is a on-off switch, but it is actually a switch that goes from on or off. This one also comes with a handy light in it so that you can see possibly if you've left something on. These are the 3 position switches. So those you can go through and program to be attached to any number of the different channels on the controller. Next up, item number 18. This is where you can actually program the name on the 10 different models. So if you have names for your trucks like I do, you can actually program that in right here. Number 19, this is actually one of my favorite parts about this radio, because this is something that's very, very easy to program in comparison to other radios that I've had. And these are the alarms. So these alarms will go off when you get a low voltage scenario in either your transmitter or your receiver. Meaning that when your batteries get low in your controller, an alarm will go off and tell you that the batteries are getting low. This will also tell you that the receiver voltage is getting low, and that means that the battery in your car is getting low. And that is a great function, especially if you're doing something with crawling or trailing, even with bashing or nitro. Especially with nitro, you don't want the batteries powering your receiver to go completely dead, because your car can go all rogue on you. So this is a very handy feature. It's also very, very easy to program in. As you can see, the RX is the receiver. It's set to go off at 4 volts. So when the receiver level gets to 4 volts, my controller will tell me that I'm getting low on battery power. Next up in our menu, we have the gyro. So by default, the gyro is turned on, and there are 2 different modes that you can set it to, standard or VR. Now, VR means that you can adjust it via the 3rd channel dial, which is here, and that is to adjust the sensitivity. In the standard mode, you're going to be adjusting it here at this screen, and that adjusts the sensitivity here. So next up on our menu is number 21, and that is F/F, F/S, and that is the failsafe. So let's say your radio and transmitter get disconnected, and you want the controller to have a setting so that the receiver will go to a default place if that ever happens. Typically, what I do is the throttle program. You press the throttle trigger full forward for 100% brake. And now if anything is ever disconnected, and let's say it gets disconnected when I'm at full throttle, instantly the car will apply the brakes and stop wherever it's at. Next item, 22, ID seed on this controller means that you can bind a subsidiary receiver to the same control point. Now the final menu option in this controller is the factory reset. Reset it to the factory and start over from scratch. Trust me, I have done this a few times. I've gone through and tried to do a bunch of different programming options for cars, and it hasn't worked out very well. And rather than trying to figure out how to go back and set them to those functions, you just go in here, do a factory reset. Everything is all happy and back to the way it was when you took it out of the box. Hopefully today I've given you some information that will help you go in and program your RC6GS Radiolink 6-channel controller and be able to use it to its full capabilities. I know that sometimes these controllers can be very, very complicated, and all the different functions in them can be very, very complicated. But the best thing is you can always go in and give things a try, and if they don't work, you can always put it back to the way it was. Thank you all for watching. I really, really appreciate the support for the channel. And on this Memorial Day weekend, I want us all to remember and reflect on why we celebrate Memorial Day. And join me in checking out Operation 11 Charlie this Memorial Day and just paying homage and honoring the memory of all of our fallen soldiers. Thank you. Have a great weekend.